Picture the Great Hall of Poitiers on an evening somewhere in the early 1130s. The stone walls still hold the warmth of the day, and in Poitou, in the south of what we now call France, that warmth is real and specific. Not the grudging pale light of the north, but soft, heavy gold that settles into stone as the sun descends, as though the building itself has been slowly breathing it in since morning. The hall smells of tallow candles and the rushes on the floor, and of that particular dusty sweetness that old stone acquires in long, kind weather. Toward the far end of the room, a man with a lute is playing something slow and low. He is not quite performing, not turning his best side toward an audience with the showman's deliberate brightness, but thinking aloud in melody, the way musicians do when they are only being half-watched. Around him a small gathering is formed. Courtiers in linen and good wool, a cleric with ink-stained fingers, a woman who has set down her embroidery to listen. They are conversing in a language that is not quite Latin and would not quite be recognized as French by anyone from Paris. Something older and rounder and more southern, a language that seems built from the ground up for the pleasure of the mouth that speaks it. And somewhere in this room, probably near the edges of things, is a girl. She is perhaps 8 or 9 years old. She has grown up inside the sound. She cannot remember a time when music was not part of the ordinary texture of an evening, when poets did not walk the corridors, when the men around her father did not argue with genuine seriousness, as though it truly mattered about the nature of love, about whether it could be distinguished from mere longing, about what beauty asked of the person who encountered it. Her name is Eleanor. She is the eldest daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and she will one day be a queen of France, and then a queen of England, and one of the most widely traveled, most fiercely contested, most written about women of the medieval world. She will cross the Alps and the Pyrenees, sail the Mediterranean, spend 15 years inside a series of English castles from which she was not permitted to leave, and outlive nearly everyone she loves. But tonight she is only a child in a warm hall, and the music is playing, and there is no particular reason to hurry anywhere. To understand what Eleanor's life felt like from inside it, not as a sequence of famous events, but as a lived experience, a series of rooms and seasons and accumulated feelings, it helps to begin not with Eleanor herself, but with the place that made her. Aquitaine was not simply a territory she would one day inherit. It was a world with its own language, its own laws, its own particular imagination of what a human life might be for. And that world shaped her so completely and so early that she would spend the rest of her very long life trying, in one form or another, to carry it with her. The duchies stretched from the Loire in the north all the way down to the first slopes of the Pyrenees, and eastward toward the great interior plateau of France. It was enormous by the standards of the time, larger in area than the royal domain of the French king, to whom its rulers nominally owed allegiance, and it was rich in particular ways of the southern lands. Vineyards already producing wine traded across much of Christian Europe, wheat and salt, and the steady commerce of port cities like Bordeaux, which had been a center of maritime trade since Roman times, and had not forgotten how to receive the world. The rivers ran broad and useful. The summers were long and genuinely warm. The winters, by northern measure, were almost gentle. The land had a quality that the people who grew up there tended to carry with them, a kind of ease, a sense that there was time, that the evening meal could be taken without hurrying, that a conversation was worth finishing properly. Whether this was temperament or climate, or simply the comfort that comes from living somewhere fertile and unhurried, it showed up in the culture, in the way the South dressed and ate and built houses, and above all in the way it made its art. Because Aquitaine's real distinction, the thing that would matter most in the long story of Eleanor's life, was its culture. The people of the South spoke Occitan, the long DOC, name for southern word for yes, and from that language, in courts and castles stretching from Poitou down through Gascony and across into Provence, there had grown something entirely new, the poetry and music of the troubadours. The troubadours were poet-musicians, most of them men, though occasionally women, who composed and performed in the vernacular, in the living, spoken language of the people around them, rather than in the Latin of the church and the schoolroom. They wrote primarily about love, about desire and devotion, about the sweet difficulty of longing for someone just out of reach, about the ennobling power of loving a worthy person, about loss of memory, and the way feeling could outlast the circumstances that gave rise to it. They developed, across generations, an elaborate set of conventions. The distant lady, the faithful devotee, the cruelty and grace of fortune, and within those conventions they worked with craftsmanship of rhythm and rhyme and image that was, by any measure, a genuine achievement. What made the troubadour tradition matter for Eleanor specifically was not only its beauty, but its assumptions. The songs imagined women as worthy of a man's highest effort and deepest feeling. They placed women at the center of a man's moral life, as the source of his inspiration, the measure of his virtue, the judge of his merit. This was idealized, certainly, and it served the troubadour's own purposes in ways that a modern reader might notice quickly. But for a girl growing up immersed in it, it was also a particular kind of education, a constant, musical insistence that women mattered, that their regard was something worth earning, that they occupied the center of the room rather than its periphery. Eleanor's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, is credited by most scholars as the earliest troubadour whose work has come down to us, the first poet in the vernacular Romance tradition whose songs we can still read and consider. 11 of his poems survive, an extraordinary number for anything from the early 12th century, and they reveal a man of surprising range. Some are comic and frankly earthly, written by someone who was twice excommunicated and appears to have found the experience more inconvenient than humbling. Others are harder to categorize, meditative, almost elegiac, a voice quietly reckoning with impermanence in ways that still feel immediate after 9 centuries. He died in 1127, when Eleanor was perhaps 4 or 5 years old, young enough that her memory of him would have been more texture than portrait, the presence of a large and vivid person in the rooms of her early life rather than anything she could have put into words. But his influence did not require his continuing presence. It lived in the court he had shaped, in the poets still gathering at Poitiers, in the particular quality of attention that surrounded everything to do with music and language and the life of feeling. Eleanor absorbed all of this not as instruction, but as ordinary experience, the way children absorb the assumptions of the world around them before those assumptions have names. Her father, William X, was a different kind of man from his own father, though no less capable of quarreling with the church. He was, by most accounts, genuinely pious in his way, devoted to forms and rituals of Christian life, serious about his faith in ways his father had conspicuously not been, while finding himself, almost inevitably, on the wrong side of the most powerful churchman of the age. For several years he supported an antipope against the wishes of Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot whose voice carried further in 12th century Christendom than almost any other, and Bernard's responses to this are preserved in his correspondence with sharpness that has not softened with the centuries. William X eventually submitted, as most men eventually did when Bernard applied sufficient pressure, but the memory of the conflict followed him in ecclesiastical circles for years afterward. Within Aquitaine itself, however, he maintained what his father had built. Poets continued to gather. Troubadours continued to come south. Eleanor continued to grow up at the center of something that few courts in the Christian world could match for intellectual and artistic vitality. She learned Latin, genuinely learned it, well enough to read and write and correspond and engage with the church documents that would come to occupy so much of her political life in later years. She learned music, almost certainly, because it would have been nearly impossible not to in that court and that world. She learned the management of a great household, the reception of guests, the elaborate courtesies that governed every formal exchange between people of consequence. She learned to ride in a hunt with hawks, the hawk on the wrist, the horse moving steadily beneath her, the wide fields of Poitou spreading out in the early morning. Hawking was more than sport. It was a whole vocabulary of patience and attention, a language of relationship between the person and the bird, and Eleanor took to it as she would take to most things that rewarded careful, sustained concentration. She would carry a hawk in paintings and in the descriptions of people who saw her across the full span of her life. Her mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, died when Eleanor was still a young child, probably around 1130, when Eleanor was perhaps 7 or 8, though the specific circumstances of Eleanor's death are not recorded in any surviving source. Eleanor's younger sister Petronilla survived and remained close to her through the years that followed. A younger brother named William Aigret died in childhood not long after his mother, leaving Eleanor as the eldest of the surviving children and, eventually, the only one whose life would shape the history of the dynasty. These losses were what childhood was, In the 12th century, a landscape that included early death as a matter of fact rather than exception, absences that became ordinary before they had been fully understood. Eleanor learned, as children who have known loss early always learn, something about the impermanence of even the most solid-seeming arrangements. The court moved, as all medieval courts did, traveling between the castles and estates scattered across the ducal holdings. Poitiers, Bordeaux, Limoges, Talmont, the smaller manor houses and fortified towers that punctuated the southern landscape. Eleanor would have known them all, known the particular smell of each one, the way the vegetation changed as you traveled south toward Gascony, the gradual shift in speech as the oxen moved through its regional variations. She was learning the geography of a world she would one day govern, without being aware that she was learning it, the way children learn everything that will later turn out to matter. And it was a world that powerful men elsewhere had been watching with interest for a very long time. Aquitaine's size and wealth and the complexity of its culture made it an object of desire and calculation for every ruler with ambitions in the Western Christian world. The French crown had long looked south, with a mixture of envy and strategic patience. The question of who would control Aquitaine, through marriage, through alliance, through the slow, careful work of dynastic positioning, was never far from the minds of the men who thought about such things. Eleanor would have sensed these currents, even as a young girl, the way you sense a river's depth before you have a word for what you are feeling. In the spring of 1137, her father set out on pilgrimage to the shrine of St. James at Compostela, in the far northwest of what is now Spain. He had his reasons, the old quarrels with the church, the accumulated obligations that a man of genuine faith might wish to address before they addressed him. And before leaving, he made arrangements for his daughters. He placed them under the guardianship of Louis VI of France, the aging king in Paris who was known, with a particular affection the French reserved for a king they had grown used to, as Louis the Fat. Louis VI would have understood immediately, when the relevant documents reached him, exactly what kind of trust he was being offered and what it was worth. William X died in April that year, apparently struck down by illness on the road approaching the great cathedral at Compostela. He was not yet 40. The death was sudden enough that those who received the news in the south were not prepared for it, had not, perhaps, entirely believed it possible. The way the deaths of vigorous men in middle life always carry that quality of unreality, as though the world has made an error it will shortly correct. Eleanor received the news somewhere in Aquitaine, among the language and the landscape she had always known. She was perhaps 15 years old, though the uncertainty about her exact birth year makes even this a soft estimate, somewhere in a range of 13 to 16. She was, in any case, very young, and she was suddenly, without any particular preparation or transition, the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, the sole inheritor of the largest and richest territory in France, a young woman without a father or surviving brother, holding something enormous that the world around her would not long allow her to hold quietly or alone. The evenings would have continued. The musicians would still have played in the great hall at Poitiers. The light would still have fallen gold and warm as the sun went down behind the vineyards, and the first chill night came up from a river. But the meaning of everything had changed in the way it changes when the person who stood between you and the full way of the world is no longer there, and what had been home was now a responsibility, and what had been inheritance was now a question that powerful men were already, in courts far to the north, beginning to answer on her behalf. She had weeks, perhaps less. Then the messengers from Paris would arrive, and the discussions that would decide the next chapter of her life would begin, and the warm world of the South, the music, the Occitan, the long golden evenings, would start to recede behind her like a coastline seen from a ship that is already underway. But all of that lies ahead. For now it is enough to sit with a girl at the edge of the gathering, watching the musician at the far end of the room, listening with the focused quiet of someone who understands, even without quite knowing it yet. That listening carefully is one of the few forms of power that cannot be taken from her, and that she intends to use every form of power she has. The journey north from Bordeaux would have taken several weeks, moving through country that changed as you traveled. The vineyards gradually thinning, the warmth becoming less certain, the sky assuming by degrees that particular northern quality, wider and paler, and less committed to any single color. Eleanor traveled in the summer of 1137, not long after her wedding to Louis VII of France, which had taken place in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, with the full ceremonial weight that such an occasion required. She was a duchess and a queen now, both titles arriving almost simultaneously, in the way that life sometimes delivers its largest changes without interval or preparation. The wedding itself had been arranged at considerable speed, which was itself a kind of message about the urgency felt in Paris. Louis VI, the aging king who had been named as William X's guardian for Eleanor before the Duke's death, understood that an unmarried Duchess of Aquitaine was an opportunity that would not remain unclaimed for long. Others were watching. Others would move, given time. And Louis the Fat, despite the gout that had long since made it difficult for him to do much more than sit and govern from a distance, still had a sharp enough political mind to recognize that moving first was its own form of advantage. He sent his son south. The prince, also named Louis and known to history as Louis VII, was perhaps 16 or 17 years old at the time, not much older than Eleanor herself, and he had grown up in the most specific and peculiar circumstances. He was the second son, not originally intended to be king at all. The throne had been meant for his elder brother Philippe, who had died in a riding accident several years before, leaving the younger Louis, who had been educated in a cathedral school and expected for a time to take holy orders, suddenly and without much warning the heir to the crown of France. He had been plucked from one life, the measured, pious, scholarly life of a young man headed for the church, and dropped into another, and he had never quite stopped feeling the scene between those two existences. When he arrived in Bordeaux, he would have encountered Eleanor for the first time, and the encounter would have contained, however disguised beneath the elaborate courtesies of the occasion, the whole private difficulty of what their marriage was going to be. Picture what each of them saw. Louis saw a young woman who was already, in her bearing and her manner, entirely comfortable with the role of a person of consequence, someone who had grown up at the center of a court that treated her with genuine respect, who had been taught that her attention mattered, and that a room arranged itself somewhat in relation to her position in it. She was reportedly striking in appearance, though the specific terms in which medieval sources describe beauty are not always translatable into any useful picture. Height, fairness, a quality the chroniclers render as grace, which could mean almost anything, but the quality of self-possession, of ease within authority, that comes through clearly enough. She was at home in herself in a way that would have been immediately visible to anyone trained, as Louis had been trained to read the deportment of important people. Eleanor saw a young man who was also, by most accounts, physically attractive in the ways the age valued. Tall, fair, well-made, not unpresentable. But there was something in his manner that must have been noticeable even at first encounter, a quality of inward withdrawal, as though the visible person were only the outermost layer of someone who lived primarily in an interior space of prayer and private conscience. He wore his authority with a slight discomfort, as though it had been handed to him in a size that didn't quite fit. He was genuinely kind, genuinely good-hearted in a way that all the sources, even those most critical of his political judgment, consistently note. But there was a difference between goodness and warmth, between piety and ease, and Louis had the first of each pair, without quite the second. They were married on the 25th of July, 1137, in a ceremony whose grandeur reflected not so much any personal feeling between them as the enormous political stakes of what was being arranged. Within a matter of days, Louis VI died at Paris, and the young couple became king and queen of France before they had even completed their journey home. Paris received its new queen that autumn with a combination of official welcome and private watchfulness that capitals extend toward women who arrive from outside with too much importance of their own. The court gathered on the Isle de la Cite, the island in the Seine that had been the seat of French royal power for generations, and was a place that could not have been more different from what Eleanor had left behind. The city was genuinely impressive in scale, larger than anything in Aquitaine, a great commercial and ecclesiastical center whose churches and markets and narrow jostling streets made it feel like a different kind of world entirely. But the scale was northern and gray and vertical in a way that had nothing to do with the low, warm, horizontally spreading landscape she had grown up in. The Seine was not the broad, easy rivers of the south, but a darker, cooler presence that seemed to keep the city just slightly on the edge of dampness even in summer. The winters, when they came, arrived with an intention and a commitment that the South never matched. The court itself was, by the standards Eleanor had absorbed almost before she could speak, austere. Louis VII governed with a small and relatively sober household. He was not indifferent to beauty or refinement, but the axis of his attention ran toward the church rather than toward the kind of secular culture, the music, the vernacular poetry, the elaborate staging of feeling and desire that had been the oxygen of the Aquitanian court. His closest advisors included churchmen of real authority, men shaped by the reforming, ascetic currents in the church that were gaining force across the century. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful voice in the Christianity of that age, had his own complicated relationship with the French court, but his influence was pervasive in ways Eleanor would feel, if never directly, throughout her time in Paris. She brought people with her, of course, ladies-in-waiting, attendants, musicians from the south, the troubadour culture arriving in the northern court as both entertainment and provocation. The Parisian courtiers observed it with varying degrees of approval and suspicion. A woman of Eleanor's background was expected to bring her culture with her. That was understood. But whether the culture she brought should be allowed to reshape the court around her, to introduce its assumptions and its priorities into a world that had its own settled ways of doing things, that was a different question, and one that would take years of small daily negotiations to work through. The domestic reality of the marriage, insofar as the surviving sources allow us to see it, was complicated in ways that are fundamentally human, and therefore recognizable across any distance of time. Louis loved Eleanor. There is reasonable evidence for this, in his behavior toward her and in the obvious difficulty he experienced when the marriage was eventually ended. He was also, by temperament and training, poorly suited to particular texture of her personality. Her directness, her comfort with debate and argument, her impatience with extended piety that she may have read, unkindly but perhaps accurately, as a way of avoiding action. Eleanor, for her part, seems to have felt the constraint of Paris early and to have found her own forms of management. She threw herself into the life available to her with the focused energy that would remain one of her defining qualities throughout a very long life. She received petitioners and managed correspondence and involved herself, sometimes aggressively, in the political questions of the day. She was present, in a way that not all medieval queens were, at the intersections where ecclesiastical and secular authority negotiated with each other, and she had opinions and was willing to express them, which was its own kind of adaptation to a world that did not quite know what to do with someone of her ability and her position. The question of children was never far from any of this. A queen's primary political function was to produce heirs, and Eleanor and Louis tried to fulfill this expectation for years without producing a son. Their first daughter, Marie, was born around 1145, after nearly 8 years of marriage, and a second daughter, Alex, would follow several years later. In the political mathematics of the 12th century, daughters were not nothing, but they were not sons, and the absence of a male heir was a pressure that accumulated quietly over time, shaping the atmosphere of the marriage in ways that went beyond the purely personal. Some of the most dramatic moments of these Parisian years came from outside the marriage rather than inside it, though they reveal the fault lines of the relationship with uncomfortable clarity. Eleanor's younger sister Petronilla, who had followed her north to the French court, fell into a love affair with Raoul of Vermandois, one of Louis's high officials, a man who was already married to a woman of the House of Champagne. What followed was a tangle of ecclesiastical politics and personal desire that resulted in Raoul seeking an annulment of his existing marriage on dubious grounds, with the support of several obliging bishops, in order to marry Petronilla. The Count of Champagne, outraged on behalf of his family, appealed to the church. Bernard of Clairvaux applied his considerable pressure. Louis found himself caught between his loyalty to his official and his political need to avoid a catastrophic quarrel with both Champagne and the church. The situation slid, as such situations tended to in the 12th century, from private scandal into open military conflict, with French forces eventually moving against Champagne in a campaign that escalated beyond anything Louis had intended or prepared for. The worst moment came at Vitry-en-Perthois, where French soldiers burned a church in which local people had taken refuge. The number of those who died in the fire, men, women, children who thought the walls of the house of God would protect them, is given differently in different sources, and a specific figure cannot be stated with confidence. But it was large, and the horror of it penetrated even through professional distance that medieval chroniclers generally maintained around military violence. Louis, when news of what his forces had done reached him, was stricken. It was a kind of thing that settled into a man of his particular conscience and did not leave. He carried it as an obligation, a debt to God that required to be paid somehow, and the form that payment would eventually take would bring enormous changes into both his life and Eleanor's. The years moved through their seasons. The Paris winters, the Seine dark and cold beneath its bridges. The summers when the court might travel and the light improved, and everything felt slightly more possible. Eleanor managing her household, fighting her small and not always small political battles, writing letters in a Latin that was very good, and receiving letters from Aquitaine that reminded her, in their idiom and their assumptions, of the world she had come from. Louis praying and governing, and trying to reconcile the pull of his own conscience with the requirements of secular power, which were rarely kind of consciences of any kind. They were not miserable, exactly. They were something more complicated, and in some ways sadder than miserable. Two people who might have gotten along reasonably well in other circumstances, finding themselves ill-suited in precisely the ways that mattered most, sharing a life that demanded from each of them what the other was least equipped to provide. Louis needed a quieter partner, someone whose devotion was directed primarily inward rather than outward toward the world's business. Eleanor needed someone who could match her, who would push back, argue back, move through the world with the same restless appetite for engagement that she brought to everything. What she had instead was a gentle man of genuine faith who loved her in his way and governed France with a certain earnest muddlement, and could not quite understand why the life he was offering her was never quite enough. She would have sat by those northern windows, in the castle on the Isle de la Cite, watching the Seine go by below. The river was always going somewhere. The river was always, whatever the season, in motion, and its sound at night, when the court was quiet, must have carried into the stone like a reminder that the world outside was larger than any particular arrangement of rooms. The years passed, and the question of what her life would turn out to be remained open in ways that the official arrangements were meant to have closed. She was a queen of France, the mother of two daughters, the Duchess of Aquitaine. All of this was true. All of it was substantial. And yet she must have felt, in the long evenings of the northern court, that the real story of what she was had not yet arrived, that everything so far had been the accumulation of conditions, and that the life itself was still somewhere ahead, waiting to begin. The crusade would change that, or would try to, but that belongs to the next chapter of a very long story. And for now the river goes by beneath the window, and the candles in the hall gutter softly in a draught from the north, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, queen, duchess, 20-something years old in the city, she has never quite made her own, listens to the water and waits, in that particular patient way of people who have not yet given up on the idea that things can still become what they were always supposed to be. It began with a letter, and with a man's voice in an open field, and with a particular quality of feeling that spreads through a crowd when someone is saying something they've already, in some private part of themselves, decided they want to believe. The letter came first, an encyclical from Pope Eugenius III, issued in the winter of 1145 and circulated through courts and churches of Western Christendom with the urgency of a message that could not be deferred. The city of Edessa had fallen. Edessa, which had been the easternmost of the Crusader states established in the wake of the First Crusade, the first Christian-held city in the far reaches of what the Western Church considered the Holy Lands. Edessa had been taken by Zengi of Mosul, and the Christians who had lived and died in its defense were gone, and the edge of the Crusader world had moved considerably closer to its center, and something the letter said must be done. The voice came at Vézelay, in Burgundy, in the spring of 1146, when Bernard Clairvaux preached a new crusade before an assembly that had gathered on a hillside, because no building could have held them. Bernard's oratory was a kind that works not by argument but by feeling, a voice that seemed to find a place in the listener where conviction and longing were already waiting, and address itself there directly, bypassing the intellect with the efficiency of something aimed. People wept. People came forward. The King of France himself came forward, and kneeling before Bernard, accepted the cross that was pressed into his hands, and the crowd around him understood that the decision had been made, and the surge of collective feeling that followed was the kind that a person carries in their body for days afterward, as a residual warmth. Eleanor was at Vézelay. She heard the sermon. And then she did something that no one quite expected, and that people have been discussing in various registers of admiration and scandal and scholarly dispute ever since. She took the cross herself. The precise nature of Eleanor's decision what it meant to her, what moved her to make it, what she hoped for and feared and imagined, is not recoverable from any surviving source. We have the fact of it, and we have the shape of what followed, and from those we can arrange a kind of plausible story about her reasoning. But we cannot actually know what it was, and that unknowability is itself part of what makes her interesting, the way certain rooms in a house are more compelling for having a door you cannot open. What we can say is that she had reasons. She was a Duchess of Aquitaine, and a crusade that would pass through and recruit from the territories she controlled was her political business, as much as any man's. She had spent nearly a decade in a court and a marriage that had never quite fit her, and the idea of movement, genuine, large-scale, purposeful movement to the world, may have appealed to something in her that the routines of Paris had been slowly starving. And she knew, though she may not have framed it to herself in exactly these terms, that remaining behind while the king and his court went east would leave her in an awkward and vulnerable position in a French political world that was not always kind to powerful women whose husbands were elsewhere. She also, some sources suggest, recruited her own vassals, the great lords of Aquitaine, bringing their forces under her direct banner rather than Louis's, a practical expression of her separate authority that some of the French courtiers would have noted with the careful neutral faces that people in hierarchical institutions were when they are filing something away for later consideration. She reportedly insisted on bringing ladies-in-waiting, a company of noble women who would travel with the army and maintain something like a proper household for the Queen of France in the field. This too raised eyebrows, though it was not without precedent. Women had traveled with crusading forces before, and the supporting roles that large military enterprises had always required. The stories that accumulated around this moment, as stories will, tales of Eleanor and her ladies appearing in martial dress, of Amazonian theatrics at the moment of taking the cross, should probably be received as legend rather than history. They have the quality of embellishment. The image is too perfect, too satisfyingly dramatic to be taken entirely at face value. But the kernel of something real may lie within them, which is simply that Eleanor's presence was large enough and unusual enough that it invited this kind of story-making, the way significant people in significant moments always attract the shaping attention of those who later tell the tale. The army assembled and began to move in the early summer of 1147. It was an enormous undertaking. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers and pilgrims and camp followers and clergy, moving to the length of France, and then east of the Holy Roman Empire, aiming for Constantinople, and then south and east toward the territories where the crusade would eventually have to be decided. The logistics of moving such a mass of people across such distances were staggering even by modern measures, and by the measures of the 12th century, they were simply a sustained miracle of organization and optimism, with the emphasis perhaps more heavily on the optimism. Eleanor would have experienced a journey in better conditions than most, traveling in the kind of organized comfort that a royal household on the move was able to maintain. Tents and furniture and the accoutrements of a proper court carried along on wagons and mule-back, familiar faces around her, the daily rhythms of a household partially preserved even in the middle of a march. But the journey itself was still genuinely hard. The roads through the empire became increasingly uncertain. The German forces of Conrad III, who were moving along a parallel route on a slightly earlier schedule, were already straining capacity of local supply and goodwill, and the French forces that followed found a landscape of diminished hospitality and diminishing resources. The summer heat pressed down. Animals died on the road. Provisions ran short in ways that affected even those with the resources to manage better than most. Constantinople, when they reached in the autumn, was something else entirely, a city so much larger and richer and stranger than anything in the Western experience that travelers from Europe tended to describe their encounters with it in terms that reached the superlative and fell short. Eleanor would have seen the Hagia Sophia, vast and gold-lit and quiet in a way that cathedral spaces rarely achieved, a quality of suspended air, of something held. She would have been received at the court of the Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who was himself an extraordinary figure, Byzantine-educated and deeply cosmopolitan, engaged with the Western world in ways his predecessors had often been too proud or too cautious to manage. The negotiations between Louis and Manuel were complicated. The Byzantines had their own strategic interests in the region, which did not always align neatly with the Crusaders' goals. But as a matter of experience and sensation, Constantinople must have been like stepping into a different century, a world that had maintained and continued to elaborate refinement that the West was only beginning in the 12th century to feel its way toward again. The difficulty to define the crusade and would fracture with a completeness that neither Louis nor Eleanor could have fully anticipated. Whatever remained of their marriage arrived not in combat, but in the mountains of Anatolia in the deep winter of 1147 to 48. The French forces were crossing through difficult terrain, moving in a long column through passes where the ground was uncertain, and the local guides were unreliable, and the threat of Turkish mounted archers lurked in the high ground on either side. At a crossing in the mountains, the sources disagree on precise location and the precise sequence of events with a thoroughness that has made reconstruction difficult for every historian who has attempted it. The column became dangerously extended. The vanguard moved ahead faster than the rear guard could follow, and in the gap between them the army became exposed in a way that invited exactly the kind of attack that came. The losses were significant. The chaos of a mountain ambush in winter, with a column that could not easily maneuver and could not quickly reassemble, was a kind of military disaster that stripped away a great deal in a very short time. And the question of responsibility, of who had moved too fast, who had failed to hold the line, whose failure of coordination had created the gap through which catastrophe arrived, was exactly the kind of question that gets answered in the immediate aftermath according to political need rather than careful inquiry. Some accounts, then and later, placed the blame with Eleanor's contingent specifically, suggesting that they had moved too fast or had disregarded orders or had failed to hold position in some way that contributed to the disaster. How much of this reflected genuine fact and how much reflected the tendency to make available targets available was a question the sources cannot answer cleanly. What it did, regardless of its accuracy, was add the sharp edge of blame to what had already become a tense and difficult relationship between Eleanor and the men who managed Louis's military enterprise. They arrived at Antioch in the early spring of 1148, and here the story enters a territory that has produced the most lasting and the most contested account of Eleanor's life. Antioch was one of the great crusader cities, a place of considerable size and a culture that had absorbed, over the generations since the First Crusade, a complicated mixture of Western Christian, Byzantine Greek, and Eastern influences, a world at an intersection, rougher and more provisional than Constantinople, but with its own genuine richness. The ruler of Antioch was Raymond of Poitiers, Eleanor's uncle, her father's brother, a man who had grown up in the same Aquitanian court she had, who spoke her language in every sense of the phrase, who had left the South decade before and made his fortune and his reputation at the very edge of the crusader world, and yet remained, in his bearing and his manner, unmistakably a man of the South. Eleanor had not seen him since childhood. Whether she had thought of him often, in the long northern years, we cannot know. But the reunion, whatever its private emotional content, was also immediately practical. Raymond wanted the French crusading forces to help him reconquer Edessa, the fallen city whose loss had prompted the entire enterprise, rather than continuing south toward Jerusalem, which was Louis's intention. His argument was strategically coherent. Retaking Edessa was a specific purpose for which the crusade had been called, and leaving it to pursue the broader and less urgent goal of reinforcing the holy city seemed, to Raymond, a misapplication of resources. Eleanor agreed with him, or at the very least, she was willing to say that she agreed with him, which in the circumstances amounted to a political intervention of considerable force. She reportedly supported Raymond's position in the discussions, advocated for it to Louis, and, according to accounts that were written down after the fact and must be handled accordingly, invoked the grounds of consanguinity to suggest that she and Louis were too closely related for marriage to be valid under canon law, and that she might seek an annulment. What actually happened in Antioch between Eleanor and Raymond of Poitiers, in the private conversations that took place in the rooms and gardens of the palace, behind the closed doors that the episode's title reaches toward, is not known and cannot be known. What happened afterward is that the rumors began. The suggestion, circulated then and amplified in later years by chroniclers who were not always disinterested parties, that the relationship between Eleanor and her uncle was more than familial, that what passed between them in Antioch was something the church would not have sanctioned, and that Louis had every right to find intolerable. These rumors should be understood as what they most probably were, a way of managing a powerful woman whose political judgment had inconvenienced powerful men. The accusation of sexual misconduct was the instrument most readily available in the 12th century for discrediting a woman who was causing difficulty through legitimate means, through argument, through the assertion of her own legal rights, through the deployment of political support that she was entitled by her position and her lands to deploy. Whether any of the chroniclers who recorded the rumors believed them, or whether they understood perfectly well what they were doing, cannot be recovered now. The rumors were recorded. They moved through subsequent centuries with the persistence that scandalous stories always achieve. They have been accepted and dismissed and re-examined by every generation of scholars since. And the current weight of historical opinion rests fairly firmly on the side of dismissal. What is not dismissed, because it is too well attested, is the fracture. Louis, in the end, refused Raymond's strategic proposal and insisted on moving south toward Jerusalem. He and Eleanor fought. The sources agree on this much, though the specific substance of the confrontation is filtered through accounts written by men who were not present and who had their own investments in the story's outcome. Louis took Eleanor from Antioch by force, or something very close to force, in the early hours of the morning, which is a kind of detail that, true or not, suggests the depth of the break between them. Raymond watched them go. He would die in battle against Nur ad-Din not long afterward, and Eleanor would learn of it eventually, at whatever remove the slow communications of the age allowed, and what she felt when she learned of it, whether grief, whether a particular loss of losing the person who most completely shared her first language and her first world, is not recorded anywhere in anything that has survived. The crusade itself came to very little. Jerusalem received the forces that arrived, and there were councils and disagreements about strategy, and an attack on Damascus that was abandoned before it could produce any result, and the particular hollowness that follows large collective efforts that have cost a great deal and achieved almost nothing. Louis and Eleanor were still, technically, married. They were also, in any sense that mattered to the daily texture of life, very far from each other in a way that people who have said unretractable things are far apart even when they occupy the same room. The return journey brought one more notable episode, a meeting with Pope Eugenius III at Tusculum, where the Pope who had called a crusade now tried to repair the marriage that the crusade had broken. He arranged private conversations with each of them, reconciled them formally and ceremonially, and reportedly had them sleep in a bed that he himself had blessed, a gesture that managed to be both touching and slightly absurd in a way that institutional attempts to address personal feeling often are. The sources suggest that Louis's feelings for Eleanor were still genuine, and that he was willing at Tusculum to try again. The sources are less clear about Eleanor's feelings, which perhaps tells us something in itself. They sail for home separately, on different vessels, a practical arrangement that may also have been an emotional one. The Mediterranean in autumn was not guaranteed to be kind, and indeed both ships encountered serious difficulty in storms along the way, and both eventually arrived safely back on western shores, and crusade was over, and nothing it aimed to accomplish had been accomplished, and the marriage was still formally intact. And Eleanor was somewhere in her late 20s and had seen Constantinople and Antioch and the hills above Jerusalem, and particular blue of the Mediterranean at the edge of the Holy Land. And the question of what her life would become was still, against all odds, entirely open. The road had been very long and had turned back on itself in ways no one had planned for, and she had arrived not at a destination, but at a threshold, a place where one part of the story was clearly ending and another, though its shape could not yet be seen, was preparing to begin. The annulment came in March 1152, at a council convened at Beaugency on the Loire, and was conducted with the careful procedural decorum that the Church extended to situations where a great deal of political feeling was being managed through the language of canon law. The grounds were consanguinity. Eleanor and Louis were discovered, after nearly 15 years of marriage, to be related within the prohibited degrees, a finding that was almost certainly true in a technical sense, and almost certain arrived at because both parties, or at least one of them, wanted it to arrive. The Church's lawyers were thorough, the documents were appropriately dense, and the outcome was as settled as these things could be made to appear. Their daughters, Marie, who was around 7 years old, and Alex, who was perhaps 3, remained with their father, as the custom of the time and the logic of French dynastic politics required. Eleanor walked away from Beaugency with her titles restored to her full and separate possession, her lands returned to her authority, and 2 children she would not raise and would see rarely in the years ahead. What this cost her in the private economy of feeling is not something any source records. She was a woman of the 12th century, moving through a world that did not set much store by a mother's interior experience when the practical arrangements had been made. She would find her way to both daughters again, in different circumstances and different seasons of her life. But the morning after Bugency, she was riding south alone, or nearly alone, with the lawyer still winter cold to her left and the question of her future so entirely open that it must have felt like the air itself had more space in it than usual. She did not stay alone for long. Almost immediately, with a speed that suggests prior arrangement, though the evidence for when and where any prior arrangement might have been made is not conclusive, she received and accepted a proposal of marriage from Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, heir to the largest military and political ambition in the Western world, who was at this point somewhere around 18 or 19 years old, 11 years her junior, and in no particular way similar to the man she had just left. She had to reach him first, which required crossing a landscape that was suddenly, inconveniently, full of men who understood what she represented and intended to have it. Two separate lords, Theobald of Blois and Geoffrey of Anjou, who was Henry's own younger brother, apparently moved to intercept her on her journey south from Bugency, each hoping to force a marriage that would deliver Aquitaine into their hands through the simple mechanism of controlling its duchess. Eleanor, apparently forewarned or simply alert, evaded them both, changing routes, moving faster than expected, navigating through a landscape she knew far better than either of her would-be captors. She arrived at Poitiers intact, and then sent word to Henry, and the arrangements proceeded. The wedding took place at Poitiers on the 18th of May, 1152, less than 8 weeks after the annulment. It was conducted without any particular fanfare and without the kind of international attention that Eleanor's first wedding had attracted, which was itself a political statement, or at least a political fact. This marriage was being presented not as an event that required the world's endorsement, but as something already decided between two people who did not feel they needed to ask anyone's permission. Louis, when he learned of it, was reportedly furious. Not only because the union created an immediate and formidable rival power on its borders, but because Eleanor had not sought his approval as her feudal overlord for the remarriage, as she was technically required to do. The fury was understandable. The oversight was deliberate. And then there was Henry himself, standing in the hall at Poitiers in the spring warmth, Eleanor's landscape and Eleanor's language all around him. He was not a tall man, by the accounts that describe him, compact and broad-shouldered, with a physical energy that seemed too large for whatever room he occupied, a habit of restless movement that meant he was almost never entirely still. His hair was reddish, his eyes the specific gray that northern sources sometimes describe as capable of sudden coldness, and his hands, the hands of a man who rode and fought and worked with a physical confidence that connected him to the earth rather than hovering above it, were broad and capable looking. He was also, and this is important, genuinely educated. Henry had received the kind of formation that serious minds of the 12th century understood as the full preparation for a life of consequence. Latin, rhetoric, law, history, philosophy, the serious engagement with ideas that distinguished the court's intellectual life from its merely political one. He could read, and he did read, not as an ornament but as a habit, a private practice that ran alongside the public business of his life. He was said to have spoken several languages with facility. He was capable of sustained, serious conversation about law and governance and theology, though he was equally capable of the kind of explosive rage that emptied rooms and terrified subordinates and left the air afterward feeling slightly scorched. Eleanor would have recognized him immediately as someone she had argued with. This was not a small thing. After the long years of Louis's gentle, muddled, pious reasonableness, the presence of someone who engaged with ideas at full strength and expected to be engaged in return must have had the quality of fresh air entering a room that had been closed too long. In the autumn of 1154, Stephen of England died and Henry became king. The path had been long and complicated. Years of intermittent military pressure, a treaty that guaranteed Henry the succession, the patience of waiting for an aging man to finish dying, and the arrival of the kingship was not a surprise, but still a transformation. Eleanor became Queen of England as she had once become Queen of France. Through marriage to a man who was suddenly, between one season and the next, governing one of the most important kingdoms in the Christian world. She was, by this point, in her early 30s. She had been a queen before. She understood the role and its demands and its possibilities in ways that a woman coming to it fresh could not have. The English court received her with the formal welcome appropriate to a queen, though England was a different world from both Aquitaine and France. Rougher edged, more recently shaped by the violence of Stephen's reign and the chaos of decades of civil war. Speaking its own complicated mixture of French and English and the Latin of the Church and the Danish remnants that still lived in certain northern place names and coastal traditions. It was a large island and not always a comfortable one, and Eleanor would spend considerable time on it in the years ahead. Though she would never stop thinking of Poitiers as the place where the truest version of herself had been made. Their children arrived with a regularity that reflected both the ordinary expectations of the age and the evident fact that this marriage had, whatever else it was, a genuine physical vitality that the first one had struggled to achieve. William, their first son, died as an infant, which was a toll the century exacted routinely from even the most privileged families. Then came Henry, who would be known as the young king, born around 1155. Then Richard, born in 1157, in Oxford, the child who would become in later years the figure most associated with Eleanor's deepest political investments. Then Geoffrey, born in 1158. Then Eleanor, born in 1161, named for her mother. Then Joan, born in 1165. Then John, the youngest, born in 1166 or 67, the last of the 8 children, and the one who would, in his own complicated way, outlast them all. 8 children, surviving to various ages and fates, filling the household with particular noise and motion and political complexity that a large brood in a royal family always produces. Each one a potential alliance, each one a potential rival, each one a life that would intersect with Eleanor's in ways she could not have mapped from any single moment in the sequence of their births. The early years of the marriage had a quality of genuine partnership that is visible even through the imprecision of the sources. Henry and Eleanor moved together through the business of governing an empire that stretched, at its greatest extent, from the Scottish border in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, Aquitaine, and England itself, all held together by the energy of 2 people who understood power and were willing to spend themselves in its service. When Henry was on the continent, Eleanor sometimes governed England in his absence. When she was in Aquitaine, she managed the south with a directness and authority that the Aquitanian lords recognized as native to her. She was not an outsider administering their world, but its original inhabitant, returned with the resources of an empire behind her. She issued charters. She received petitions and adjudicated disputes. She managed enormous household logistics that kept the court functional across multiple territories in multiple languages, with the roads between them always uncertain, and the weather always a political factor, and the messengers always arriving slightly later than they should. She corresponded with popes and abbots and the rulers of neighboring states, in a Latin that remained precise and formidable across the whole span of her political life. She was, in the most operational sense, not a consort but a partner in governance, a distinction that mattered enormously to her and that Henry, in the early years at least, seems to have recognized and valued. What drew them together was not, or not only, the great public theater of their alliance, but something more specific and harder to name, a kind of mutual recognition between 2 people who had both spent years in circumstances where they were more capable than the situation required of them, and who found in each other, finally, something that rose to their level. Henry's intelligence was real and demanding. Eleanor's was its equal. Their arguments, and they argued, because people with their temperament always argue, and because the political decisions they faced were genuinely difficult and the stakes of getting them wrong were high, were the arguments of 2 people who both wanted to win, and both understood that winning was only useful if the winning position was actually correct. Henry's infidelities, the specific texture of his private life apart from Eleanor, began at some point in these years, as the sources hint and later make more explicit, though the timing is difficult to establish with confidence, and the most famous of his attachments, with a woman the later tradition would call Rosamund Clifford, seems to belong to a period further along in the marriage rather than these early years. Eleanor would have known, in the way that women of her position and intelligence always knew the things that the official version of events preferred not to state directly, what she felt about it, how she managed it internally alongside the sustained engagement of the political partnership, is not recoverable from anything that was written down. What is recoverable is that she kept functioning. She kept governing. She kept having children and raising children and managing the enormous machine of an itinerant royal household with a focused competence that was one of her most consistent qualities across the full length of her life. Whatever was happening between her and Henry in the rooms that history cannot see, the visible life continued with the same careful energy it had always had. There is something worth sitting within this, the gap between the public record and the private experience. The way Eleanor's inner life retreats behind the official surface of her actions as reliably as water retreats down a hillside. She left no memoir. She left no confessional letters, or none that survived. The things that mattered most to her in the daily experience of being alive inside this marriage, the pleasures, the loneliness, the anger, the accommodation, the specific weight of sleeping beside someone whose complexity rivaled your own, are simply not available to us. And perhaps were never available to anyone but her. What we have instead is the outline. Two remarkable people, a marriage that was genuinely consequential in the history of Europe, children who would between them shape the better part of the next century's politics, a partnership that contained more real mutual regard than it would later be given credit for, and a slow accumulation of frictions and distances that the years deposited like silt, invisible individually but perceptible in aggregate, so that looking back from any distance the shape of what was coming had been there for a long time before anyone chose to name it. But the naming is still some years away. For now, it is the middle years of the marriage, the mid-1160s perhaps, or a little later, and Henry is riding hard somewhere between Anjou and Normandy, always in motion, always arriving somewhere hours before he was expected. The restlessness that was his most fundamental quality, keeping him permanently in transit. And Eleanor is at Poitiers or at Westminster, or making the crossing between them on a sea that is never quite trustworthy at any season, managing the correspondence in the household and the children, and the politics of a world that requires her full attention every hour of every day. The children are growing. Richard is learning to ride, and is already at 7 or 8 years old, the one who sits most naturally on a horse, the one whose bearing carries a specific quality of someone who will be comfortable in command. Henry the young king has his father's surface charm and a certain restlessness that is his father's too, though without. Eleanor may have noticed this in the way mothers notice things about their children that no one else quite sees. Without his father's underlying hardness, the iron core that made Henry's restlessness productive rather than merely chaotic. John is very small. John is still being carried from room to room by nurses, and he has his mother's dark eyes and gives no particular sign yet of the nature he will develop. Eleanor watches them all and manages them all and loves them with the complicated love of a woman for whom love has never been entirely separable from strategy, because the world she was born into never offered her a version of love that was. The court of love she will build at Poitiers, that flowering, that cultural achievement, that last great expression of the world she came from, is still a few years ahead. The rebellion is further ahead still. But the seeds of both are already present in the daily life of a woman who is, in this middle period of her married life, still holding everything together with particular skill of someone who has never quite been able to afford to let anything fall. The day will come when she stops trying to hold it. That day is not yet, but the distance between now and then is shortening, season by season, in ways that only the distance of history makes easy to see. There is a particular quality to the light in Poitiers in late afternoon, when the sun has dropped below the angle of full force, but has not yet begun the warm collapse toward evening. It falls at a slant to the windows of the great hall of the palace, the Maubergen Tower, named for a woman who was herself a scandal of an earlier generation, the granddaughter of Eleanor's troubadour grandfather and his favorite, kept in that very tower while his duchess fumed below, and in that slanted light the stone takes on a color that is not quite gold and not quite amber, but somewhere between them, warm as bread, warm as a particular southern warmth that had shaped Eleanor, before she knew it was shaping her. She came back to Poitiers in the late 1160s, somewhere around 1168, though the specific circumstances of the return are a little difficult to pin down with precision, as so many of the movement of Eleanor's middle life are difficult to pin down, the records being what they are. What is clear is that she came, and that she came with intention, not as a woman in retreat from a difficult marriage, but as a duchess returning to the seat of her own authority, with her own plans and her own resources and her own very clear sense of what she wanted to build. She was somewhere in her mid-40s. This is worth pausing to hold for a moment. The Eleanor of Poitiers, the woman who would preside over what later ages would romanticize as one of the great cultural courts of the medieval world, was not young. She had been a queen twice and a crusader and a prisoner of rumor and a mother of 8 children and a partner in the governance of an empire, and she had done all of this across the kind of distances and difficulties that shortened most lives considerably, and yet she was still, manifestly, operating at full force, still restless, still culturally ambitious, still capable of imagining something new, and then organizing the world around her to produce it. The court at Poitiers that took shape in these years was a genuine thing, not simply the retrospective fantasy of later romantics, though it would track plenty of that in time, but an actual gathering of poets and musicians and thinkers and noble women that functioned, in its daily life, as something between a cultural salon and a serious political court. Eleanor brought her daughter Marie, now the Countess of Champagne, and a woman of considerable intelligence and patronage in her own right, who had grown up at the French court under Louis VII and arrived at Poitiers with her mother's cultural inheritance and her own developed tastes. She brought her daughter Alex as well, and other high-born women of the region, and together they assembled around them a world that was self-consciously devoted to the life of the mind and the cultivation of beauty in its various forms. The troubadours came. They had always come to Poitiers. The tradition ran back through Eleanor's grandfather and through the deep roots of Aquitanian culture that had never required anyone's permission to continue. But now the gathering had a deliberateness to it, a sense that the court was actively positioning itself as a destination for the best of the form. Poets from across the South and beyond moved to the hall and competed and performed and refined their work in a particular way that talent refines itself when it is surrounded by other talent that will not settle for the merely competent. Among those associated with the court in this period was Bernard de Venedorn, who is by many measures the greatest of all the troubadours, a poet whose work achieves a directness and a depth of feeling that the formal conventions of tradition might seem designed to prevent, but which Bernard somehow found to the conventions rather than around them. His songs about love, the longing, the joy, the impossible distance between feeling and its object, have a quality of genuine psychological truth that keeps him alive long after most of the verse of his age has become purely archaeological. Whether Eleanor was herself a direct inspiration for any of his poems is a question that the romance of the story makes more irresistible than the evidence makes answerable, but his presence in the orbit of her court is reasonably well attested, and the connection between the culture she championed and the flowering of his art is real, whatever the specific details of their interaction. The concept most inseparably attached to the court at Poitiers, in the popular imagination, and in a good deal of the scholarly literature, is the so-called court of love. The idea that Eleanor and Marie presided over formal hearings in which questions about the nature and ethics and proper conduct of love were argued and adjudicated, as though they were matters of law, with the ladies of the court pronouncing verdicts on cases submitted to them. Did true love survive the state of marriage? Or was marriage by definition the end of courtly love? Could love be commanded? Or did a command destroy the very thing it sought to produce? What were the obligations of a devoted lover to a beloved who did not return the feeling? These questions, which have a quality that can seem either delightfully serious or seriously ridiculous depending on the mood of the reader, appear in a text called De Amore, sometimes rendered in English as the Art of Courtly Love, written by a cleric named Andreas Capellanus, who may have been associated with Marie's court at Champagne, and who attributed several of the verdicts in his account directly to Eleanor and Marie as presiding authorities. The text has fascinated and puzzled scholars for centuries. It may be a faithful record of actual proceedings. It may be an elaborate literary fiction. It may be something in between, a stylized and partially invented account of real cultural preoccupations, dressed in the form of legal proceedings because that form gave a pleasing ironic structure that a sophisticated audience would have appreciated. What seems clear is that the questions the text poses were questions that the real court at Poitiers was genuinely engaged with, even if the formal juridical machinery was a literary device rather than a literal institution. The women of Eleanor's court were thinking about love, about what it asked of people, about its relationship to social power, about whether it could be distinguished from mere possession, about what a person of genuine feeling owed to a person they loved, and whether those obligations changed depending on the circumstances of rank and availability and prior commitment. These were not idle questions. They were questions that the troubadour tradition had been circling for generations, and that the particular gathering at Poitiers was now addressing with the kind of collective focused attention that only a court fully devoted to such a project could sustain. Chrétien de Troyes, one of the great narrative poets of the 12th century, was working during this period under the patronage of Marie of Champagne, and his romances, the stories of Arthur and his knights that did so much to shape the subsequent imagination of the medieval and then the modern world, bear the imprint of the cultural values that Eleanor's court had been refining for years. The figure of Lancelot, who loves Guinevere with a devotion that costs him everything and that he nevertheless cannot renounce, carries within it the whole elaborate ethical weight of the courtly love tradition. The idea that genuine feeling is its own justification, that the person who loves truly is ennobled by the loving even when the circumstances of the love are impossible. Chrétien himself seems to have had reservations about the story he was telling, and he left his Lancelot poem unfinished, as though he could not quite bring himself to deliver a conclusion that the logic of the material demanded. But the world Eleanor and Marie had created made that story thinkable, made its particular configuration of values legible and compelling to an audience that had been prepared for it by years of troubadour culture and the assumptions it carried. Picture the evenings in the Great Hall at Poitiers during these years. The candles are lit early because the days are short and the light they cast is warm and specific, picking out the faces of the women gathered around the central space. Some with embroidery, some listening, some quietly arguing about a poem that was performed earlier and that has left behind a particular phrase that won't quite resolve itself. A musician is playing something very softly at the edge of the room, a melody that functions as background rather than performance, giving the conversation a floor to stand on. Eleanor is at the center of it, as she is always at the center of whatever room she occupies, not because she commands it, but because her quality of attention draws the room's attention in return. The way of fire draws the eyes of everyone in its vicinity, not through any effort of its own, but simply through the fact of its burning. She is perhaps 45 or 46 years old in this image, and she is, by any honest account, in her element in a way she has not been since childhood, immersed in the culture she loves, surrounded by the language she was born to, governing a court whose values she shaped and whose daily life reflects the things she finds most worth caring about. This is the version of Eleanor's life that later ages would most want to remember, the version the romance of history found most comfortable to hold. The queen of culture, the patroness of beauty, the woman who made her court a kind of living poem. But beneath the warmth of the hall, beneath the candlelight and the music and the serious play of the courts of love, something else was building. It had been building for some time. And Eleanor, who was never simply an aesthetic project, but always also a political mind of the first order, was not uninvolved in its building. Her sons were growing up. Henry the young king, the eldest surviving son, had been crowned as co-king of England in 1170, a practice borrowed from the French tradition of securing the succession by crowning the heir during the father's lifetime, but had been given very little actual power to go with the title. He was king in name and largely ceremonial in fact, a young man of considerable charm and very genuine frustration, who had been handed the appearance of authority, while the substance of it remained entirely in his father's large, capable, reluctant to relinquish hands. Richard in the south held Aquitaine as his nominal inheritance, but found himself similarly constrained by the reality that Eleanor's own authority in the region was still the operative fact on the ground, and that neither parent had quite finished deciding what his role there was meant to look like. Geoffrey had Brittany, or would have Brittany, subject to the same general pattern of promised inheritance, held carefully just out of arm's reach. The frustrations of these young men were real, and they were the frustrations of their situation, rather than merely of their temperament, though temperament played its part. A father like Henry II, absolute, controlling, brilliant, and constitutionally unable to share power with anyone, including the sons he genuinely loved, was a kind of father who produced exactly this combination of devotion and resentment, the way certain soils produce certain plants regardless of what you intended to grow in them. Eleanor was watching all of this. It would be too simple and too dramatic to say that she engineered the rebellion that was coming, that she sat in her candlelit hall and calculated the moves that would deploy her sons against their father as pieces in a political game she was playing for her own advantage. The reality was probably less clean and more human than that. A mother who understood her sons better than their father did, who agreed with their assessment of their situation, who shared their frustration in ways she did not choose to suppress, and who may have encouraged her thinking in ways that fell short of outright conspiracy, but were considerably more than passive sympathy. She had her own grievances against Henry that by this point had been accumulating for years. The marriage had become, from whatever it had once been, something considerably less, a political alliance managed at a distance, punctuated by Henry's increasingly blatant infidelities, governed by his absolute unwillingness to share the real exercise of power with anyone, including the woman who had brought to marriage an inheritance as large and as consequential as his own. Eleanor had not become less ambitious or less capable in the years since the wedding at Poitiers. She had simply found herself in a position where her ambition and capability were being steadily, systematically, and perhaps deliberately sidelined by a man who needed no rivals and whose definition of partnership had narrowed considerably since the early years. The rebellion of 1173 arrived, as such things tend to arrive, not as a single decisive moment of rupture, but as a culmination of a long accumulation, the point at which the weight of everything that had been building finally exceeded the tensile strength of what was holding in place. Henry the young king fled his father's court in March of that year and crossed to France, where Louis VII, still watching, still patient, still finding his opportunities in the difficulties of the man who had taken his wife and his duchy in the same season, received him with every expression of sympathy. Richard and Geoffrey followed, and then the rebellion was formally a thing, with the King of France backing the king's sons against the king, which was a kind of situation that Henry II had spent his entire reign trying to prevent, and that he now found himself inside. Eleanor's role in what followed is not entirely clear from any single source, but the general shape of it is documented. She was moving in the autumn of 1173, and the direction of her movement was toward France. And the most plausible reading of her intention is that she was going to join her sons, or to cross into territory where she could support them, or simply to place herself outside the reach of a husband who would shortly understand that she had been, in whatever measure, part of what was being brought against him. She did not make it. Somewhere on the road, some accounts say she was disguised, traveling as a man, which has the quality of the kind of story that attaches itself to dramatic moments and may or may not reflect a literal fact. She was intercepted by Henry's men and taken into custody. The court at Poitiers was over. The candles in the great hall were not yet cold, not in any literal sense. But the gathering was dispersing already, the poets making their separate ways toward other patrons and other courts, the particular configuration of attention and intention that Eleanor had assembled slowly undoing itself the way a fire undoes itself when the wood is gone. She had built something real and lasting there, even if the institution itself did not survive the politics that surrounded it. The culture she had cultivated would continue, in the works of the poets she had sponsored, in the romances that her daughter Marie's court would go on producing, in the long subsequent life of the courtly love tradition that would move through the literature of the next several centuries, carrying her assumptions and her values embedded within it like seeds and fruit. All of that was still ahead. But she could not know in the autumn of 1173, on the road south, in whatever disguise or no disguise, with the sound of horses behind her and the south still ahead, getting no closer. The long silence was beginning. It would last longer than anyone, watching from outside, could quite have imagined, and Eleanor would endure it in the particular way of people who have learned, across a very long life, that endurance is not the same as surrender, that to outlast a thing is its own form of victory, even when no one is watching, even when there is no audience left and only the patient. Interior fact of continuing remains, but continuing is enough. Continuing, for a woman of her temperament, was always enough. Salisbury in winter is a particular kind of quiet, the plain that surrounds the old castle, not the cathedral city that would grow and shift southward over following centuries, but the ancient fortified rise of Old Sarum, its earthwork still sharp against the sky, its position on the chalk downs giving it the quality of something placed there deliberately by a hand that understood the value of elevation and exposure. That plain in December is a study in restraint. The grass goes gray-brown and flat. The wind comes across the open ground without interruption, without the softening that trees and buildings provide, and has a sound that is less a sound than a condition, a constant low presence that you stop hearing only because you can never stop hearing it. The sky sits low. The light is thin and arrives late, and leaves early, as though it has other places to be, and is only passing through. Eleanor of Aquitaine arrived here, or somewhere very like here, in the early months of her captivity, and she would remain here or in Winchester, or in Chinon, or move between a small rotation of English castles and residences whose common quality was that they were surrounded by Henry's people and that she was not permitted to leave them for the better part of 15 years. 15 years. It is worth sitting with this number for a moment, turning it over slowly, the way you turn over stone to see what is underneath. She was somewhere around 50 years old when her captivity began, having spent the preceding decades in almost constant motion across one of the largest political territories in the Western world. She had crossed the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Mediterranean. She had governed territories in multiple languages. She had been present at the creation of literary works that would shape the imagination of Europe for centuries. She was a woman for whom stillness had never been a chosen condition, for whom the absence of movement and engagement and the daily pressure of events would have been, by any measure, a form of deprivation as real as cold or hunger. And then the doors closed, and the world outside continued without her. The records from these years are sparse in the particular way that records become sparse when someone powerful wants a situation to exist without being examined too closely. Henry II did not lock Eleanor in a dungeon. He was not, in this as in most things, motivated by cruelty for its own sake. He was motivated by calculation, by the recognition that a free Eleanor was a dangerous Eleanor, that her position as Duchess of Aquitaine and her established relationships with the troubadour culture and the southern lords and the wider network of European political connections made her, if allowed to operate freely, a continuing source of threat to the stability of the arrangements he was trying to maintain. The solution was not elimination, but containment. She was a queen and a duchess and the mother of his children, and a person whose treatment would be noted and commented upon by the courts of Christendom. And so the containment had to be managed with a certain outward propriety. She was given accommodation appropriate to her station. She had attendants, though not of her own choosing, which meant that the people around her were at minimum reporting to Henry, and at most were actively instruments of his supervision. She had access, in some form and at some level, to books and correspondence, because the complete removal of these things from a person of her education and habits would itself have been noticed as a particular brutality. She was occasionally brought out for state occasions, brought to court or presented in contexts where her visible existence and apparent welfare could be pointed to as evidence that she was being treated reasonably. None of this made it anything other than what it was. The question that the long captivity poses, the question that has occupied every person who has spent time thinking seriously about Eleanor's life, is simply what happened in there, not politically, because politically the answer is more or less that nothing happened, which was the point, but internally, in the life that went on behind the quiet walls, in the mind of a woman who had every reason for bitterness and grief and rage, and who had, simultaneously, the long practice of self-management that her entire life had required of her. We know almost nothing with confidence. The sources are so thin from these years that the historian working on Eleanor's captivity faces the disconcerting experience of reaching for evidence and finding mostly absence. A letter here, a mention in an administrative record there, an occasional reference in a chronicle that places her somewhere at some point. The outlines of a life can be faintly traced. The interior of it is simply not accessible. What we can reasonably infer from the shape of the life that surrounded the captivity is a little. She was not completely cut off from the world. News reached her. She would have known the broad movements of political events, would have heard, through whatever channels remained open, about the progress of her sons and the ongoing affairs of the territories she had governed and the courts she had patronized. She may have continued to write letters, though how many of these were intercepted or suppressed we cannot determine. She was a woman of genuine religious devotion, not the consuming, almost consuming piety of Lewis, but the practical faith of someone who had grown up in a world where the church was woven into every aspect of ordinary life and who had, across her decades, developed a relationship with that faith that was her own, composed of private conviction rather than public performance. Prayer, in such circumstances, would have been both comfort and structure, a form of ordered time in a situation where the passage of time had otherwise been stripped of its usual markers. The liturgical hours, the daily rhythm of the church's calendar, the recurring feasts and fasts and commemorations that gave medieval life its temporal shape, these would have continued through captivity, as they continued everywhere. And they would provide a kind of companionship that was independent of human presence, a framework for the days that could not be taken away. The news that came through the walls in the early years of the captivity had a quality that must have been very hard to receive. The rebellion of her sons had failed. Henry II, responding with a military ruthlessness that was his most formidable quality, had crushed the uprising with a speed and effectiveness that left the rebels with little choice but to submit or flee. Richard and Geoffrey eventually made their peace with their father. The negotiations conducted with the careful surface of reconciliation overlaying whatever unresolved substance remained beneath. Henry the young king, Eleanor's eldest surviving son, received the same formal forgiveness that his brothers did, and returned to a life of frustrated partial authority and his father's careful management. The young king died in 1183 in Martel, in the Dordogne, of fever that took him quickly. He was 28 years old. He had been, by all the accounts that survive him, a genuinely charming and fundamentally unhappy young man, possessed of the surface qualities of kingship without the interior resources that made kingship sustainable, a person who had been shaped by expectation, and then left without the substance that might have given the expectation meaning. His death, which Eleanor learned from wherever she was being held, was the first of the losses that would mark the latter half of her captivity. The slow erosion of the generation below her, the children she had brought into the world, and whom she was not present to grieve properly. Geoffrey followed, in 1186, dying in a tournament in Paris at 30 years old. The circumstances murky enough that the story would later attract the embellishment that unexpected early deaths always attract. 2 sons gone, while she was still confined, still moving between the English castles, still waiting in a particular suspended state of a person who has ceased to be able to make plans because the fundamental condition of their life is not within their control. John was still young. Richard, always Richard, the son most fully and most enduringly connected to Eleanor's deepest investments, was in the south, governing Aquitaine with military energy that suggested he had absorbed rather more of both his parents than either might have been comfortable fully acknowledging. And Henry II was aging, though he would not have admitted it and would not have allowed it to slow him significantly until it was too late to slow for any other reason. The empire he had built and managed with such ferocious, sustained intensity was beginning to show the strains that empires built around a single extraordinary personality always eventually show. They depend, too, completely on that personality's continued functioning to have developed sufficient institutional resilience for the moment when the personality fails. Henry had kept everything in motion by perpetual personal intervention, and the perpetual personal intervention required a Henry who was still the man he had been at 30, and that man was becoming, in the middle 1180s, harder and harder to maintain. There is a letter that exists from these years, though its precise dating is uncertain, and its authenticity has been examined with a caution that careful historians bring to documents that are too useful to be immediately trusted. Written in Latin, addressed to Pope Celestine III, it speaks in a voice of control but genuine anguish about captivity and loss, and the particular pain of a mother who has outlived her children and cannot grieve them properly, who is kept from the world in which her grief might have found some form of expression or release. Whether the letter is genuinely Eleanor's or a later composition in her name, or something in between, a reworking of genuine material by a clerical hand that reshaped the raw feeling into rhetorical form, is a question that cannot be definitively settled. But it has been taken seriously by enough serious people that it deserves to be mentioned, and the feelings it expresses are consistent with everything else we know about Eleanor's situation and temperament. If it is hers, or even partly hers, it suggests something important. That the 15 years of captivity did not produce the kind of interior collapse that might have been expected, that the woman who emerged from it was not diminished by it in the way that prolonged confinement diminishes most people, but had spent the years in some form of sustained interior engagement that kept her mind and her will intact. The letter is not broken. It is angry, and it is sorrowful, and it is composed with the care of someone who understands that the shape of an argument and the choice of a word are not ornamental but functional, that saying a thing precisely is a different thing from saying it approximately, and that precision and expression of genuine feeling is its own form of resistance to the conditions that produce the feeling. That is, in the end, the most plausible account of what the silence contained, resistance, not the dramatic resistance of plots and messages and secret communications, Though some of these may have existed in forms of records have not preserved, but the quieter and in some ways more demanding resistance of remaining fully oneself in conditions designed, not perhaps intentionally, but effectively, to dissolve selfhood, to keep thinking clearly, to keep feeling specifically rather than generally, to maintain the standards of mind and spirit that have been built across 5 decades of remarkable experience, in the absence of most of the things that had seemed, from outside, to be the conditions of that building. She was moved from time to time. Winchester to Sarum to Ludgershall to various other residences whose names appear in the administrative records without further detail. The moves were probably made for practical reasons, castle maintenance, the logistics of staffing, the occasional requirement to bring her to court for some political purpose. But they also had the effect of preventing any single place from becoming too fully hers, of ensuring that the rootedness she had always drawn from the south, from Poitiers and the warm stone and the Occitan and the vineyards, would not be replicated in any of these northern interiors. The English landscape would have been visible from the windows of these places, in all its various English seasons. She had never been a woman who loved England the way she loved Aquitaine. The land was simply too different, too northern, too wet, too flat in some places, and bleakly exposed in others, lacking particular generosity of landscape that the South possessed. But she had lived in it long enough to know it with a knowledge that comes not from love, but from long acquaintance. The kind of knowledge you develop for a place by simply being inside it through all its weathers, until you know what the light looks like in January, and how the mud smells in March, and what quality of silence descends on a clear August night when a harvest is in. She would have known all of this from her windows. She would have watched the seasons move through the English country with the attentiveness of someone who has very little else to watch, who has been given by circumstance the kind of enforced contemplative stillness that monks and mystics sought deliberately, and that most people in ordinary active life never achieve, because ordinary active life keeps offering more urgent things to attend to. Perhaps there was something in it. Even so, perhaps the years of silence gave back, alongside everything they took, a quality of interiority that the previous 5 decades of relentless outward motion had not allowed to develop. She emerged from the captivity, as she would emerge, as the next part of the story will show, not as a woman undone by what happened to her, but as someone who seemed, if anything, to have been in some hard-to-define way deepened by it, as certain materials are deepened by sustained pressure, taking on a density and a gravity that they did not have before. But this is interpretation, and it should be held loosely, as interpretation always should. It is also possible that she was simply Eleanor, that the qualities she had carried into captivity were the same qualities she carried out of it, not because the years had done nothing to her, but because they were not sufficient to do what they might have done to someone less fundamentally themselves. Henry II died on the 6th of July, 1189 at Chinon, having learned in his final days that his youngest son John, the last of his children, the one he perhaps trusted most among those who remained, had joined the rebellion that Richard was leading against him. The reports of his death describe a man who had been reduced by illness and by the accumulated weight of betrayal to something very different from the force of nature he had been for most of his life. He died in the castle at Chinon on a hot July day, and the word went out across the territories of the Angevin Empire and eventually, through whatever channel reached her, arrived where Eleanor was waiting. She was approximately 67 years old. She had been confined in one form or another for the better part of 16 years. She was alive and intact and, as would very quickly become apparent, in full possession of every faculty and every instinct that had made her consequential before the doors had closed around her. Richard, who was now King of England, sent word immediately that she was free. The doors opened. The light came in, whatever light there was, in whatever season, falling across the threshold of a room that contained her for far too long. She walked out into it. And then, because she was Eleanor, she got to work. The world had been moving without her for 16 years, and there was an enormous amount to be done, and she was not, it turned out, in any way finished with it. The first thing she did, once she was free, was move, not away from anything in particular. She was already away. The confinement was already behind her. The world already opening back out in every direction, but toward things, specific things, with the purposeful momentum of someone who has had 16 years to compose a list and is not interested in working through it slowly. She traveled through England that autumn of 1189, visiting towns and castles and ecclesiastical establishments with a speed and a comprehensiveness that would have been remarkable in a woman of 30 and was, in a woman of nearly 67 who had just emerged from a decade and a half of forced inactivity, something closer to extraordinary. She released prisoners from the jail she passed through, offering, as one chronicle has it, a general act of clemency justified by her own experience of confinement, though the political calculations that accompanied the mercy were no doubt fully operational. She received oaths of fealty, managed the running business of governance, put the administrative machinery of England in order for a king who had not yet arrived to claim his throne. When Richard landed in England and was crowned in September of 1189, the country he received was in considerably better condition than the country he might otherwise have inherited, and a portion of the credit for that belonged to the woman who had spent the summer ensuring it. He was 31 years old at his coronation, and he stood in Westminster Abbey with the crown heavy on his head and his mother's eyes on him, and the relationship between them, which had been sustained across the years of her captivity by whatever threads of communication the circumstances allowed, and which had survived Henry's long displeasure, and which was in some sense the central emotional fact of Eleanor's life from Richard's birth onward, resumed in its full and active form, as, though the intervening years had been a parenthesis rather than a permanent condition, a long breath held and now released. Richard left for the crusade the following year, in 1190, with the energy and the organizational ambition that characterized everything he did, a man who had his father's restlessness and his mother's strategic clarity, and who was, as a military commander in the field, operating at a level that his contemporaries recognized as exceptional even by the elevated standards of an age that produced many capable commanders. He was going east to pursue the same goals that the Second Crusade had failed to achieve, and he went with better resources and better planning than any crusade since the first, and the campaigns he conducted in the Holy Land were genuinely remarkable in their operational effectiveness, even though they did not ultimately produce a recovery of Jerusalem that remained the stated objective. Eleanor did not go with him this time. She was too old for another Eastern campaign, and there was work to be done in the West, and the lesson of the Second Crusade, the cost of it, in every currency she had paid, was not something she would have revisited with any desire for repetition. She remained in England and France, governing and corresponding and watching the news from the East arrive in the slow, imprecise, often weeks delayed form that distance imposed on all information in the 12th century, and managing her worry in the way she managed everything, by giving her hand something useful to do while her mind held a larger concern at a functional distance. She did cross the Pyrenees for him, in the winter of 1190 to 91. She was nearly 69 years old, and she crossed from the great mountain ranges of Europe in winter weather, accompanied by a traveling court, in order to collect a bride for her son from the court of Navarre. Berengaria of Navarre was the woman Richard had chosen, or had agreed to accept, and she was waiting in the south, and Eleanor went south to fetch her and bring her east, sailing to Sicily and then further, following the route of the crusade at a distance, finally delivering Berengaria into Richard's company in Cyprus, where they were married in the spring of 1191. She was there for the wedding. She was 69 years old, and she had just crossed the Pyrenees in winter and the Mediterranean in spring, and she watched her son marry, and then turn around and came home, because there was always, somewhere, something that needed doing, and she was always, somehow, still the person to do it. The news of Richard's capture arrived in the last weeks of 1192 and the early days of 93. He had been making his way home from the Holy Land, taking a route through Central Europe that was both politically inadvisable and, as events proved, actively dangerous. Duke Leopold of Austria, with whom Richard had quarreled in the Holy Land in ways that diplomacy had not subsequently repaired, recognized him and seized him. He was eventually transferred to the custody of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who understood immediately and with the practiced precision of an experienced political mind exactly what he had and what it was worth. What followed was one of the great negotiations of the medieval period. The determination of a ransom so large that the raising of it would strain every financial resource of the English crown, the correspondence between the emperor and the various parties who had interest in the outcome, the slow, grinding work of assembling the sum from the taxation, and the borrowing and the extraction that fell upon the population of England with the weight of an obligation that most of them had done nothing to incur. Eleanor was central to this process in ways that go beyond her nominal ceremonial role. She wrote to Pope Celestine III, the same pope to whom she may have written during her captivity, in terms that were formally respectful and substantively pointed, arguing for the Church's intervention in a situation that had significant implications for the integrity of the crusading enterprise and for the general security of men returning from the service across. The letters that survive from this period, and can be attributed to her with reasonable confidence, have a quality that rewards the attention of anyone who has followed her life to this point. They are precise. They are controlled. They deploy the formal conventions of medieval Latin correspondence with a fluency that is not merely competent, but genuinely masterful, bending the conventions toward her purposes with the ease of someone who has been working in the medium for 50 years and no longer has to think about the mechanics. And underneath the formal surface, the feeling is unmistakable. A mother who is afraid for her son, and who is also, simultaneously, a political actor of the first order doing everything in her considerable power to correct the situation, and who has long since learned not to let the fear interfere with the action, because the action is the only thing that can actually help. Richard was released in February of 1194, after somewhat less than 14 months of captivity, upon the payment, or the secured promise of payment, of the ransom. He came home to a country that had been held together in his absence by the combination of his mother's political authority and the administrative competence of the officials who had understood that their own positions depended on the kingdom's stability. His younger brother John had made several attempts to exploit the situation for his own advantage, with the kind of unreliable opportunism that would characterize his entire political career, and had achieved very little, partly because the ground had been held against him by people who understood Eleanor's wishes and were not inclined to disregard them. Richard died on the 6th of April, 1199, in the Limousin at a small and relatively obscure castle called Caillois-Chabrol, from a crossbow bolt wound that became infected in a way that even small wounds could become infected in a world without the understanding of how infection worked or how it might be prevented. He died in his mother's arms, as the story is often told, and whether the specific detail is accurate in its physical particulars or whether it's the kind of story that accumulates around deaths that matter enormously to the people who survive them, it captures something true about the relationship, about the fact that Eleanor was there at the end of a very long journey made at speed by a woman now in her mid-70s, as she had been at the beginning of so many things. She outlived him. She had already outlived William, who died in infancy, and Henry, who died at 28 in Martel, and Geoffrey, who died at 30 in Paris. She would outlive Richard, who died at 41, and eventually she would outlive nearly everyone she had known across the full span of her extraordinary life. This is the arithmetic of extreme old age, and it has its own particular quality of grief, not the sharp, sudden grief of unexpected loss, which has a mercy of surprise, but the accumulated weight of having been present for so many endings, the way the world thins around a person who has lived very long, as the population of familiar faces slowly reduces itself to absence. She attended to the business of succession with the focused competence that had characterized her response to every crisis across the whole length of her life. John became king, whatever Eleanor's private estimate of his readiness or reliability, and she supported him as she had supported Richard and had tried, in their time, to support her other sons, with the full deployment of her authority and her relationships and her deep familiarity with the political landscape of both England and the continent. She attended John's coronation. She put what weight she could behind the stability of his inheritance. And then, in the winter of 1200, she crossed the Pyrenees again. She was 78 years old. The mountains in winter were what they had always been, cold and high and genuinely dangerous. The passes unpredictable in a season that did not guarantee safe passage to anyone, regardless of their importance or their urgency. She crossed them anyway, because her granddaughter Blanche of Castile was waiting on the other side, and Blanche was needed in France, and Eleanor was still the person best positioned to make the journey and complete it. The marriage she was arranging was between Blanche and Louis, the son of the French King Philip, a union that was intended to help settle the territorial disputes that had been grinding away at the border between the Angevin territories and the French crown for decades. It was a political calculation of the first order, conducted at the highest level, and Eleanor conducted it. Traveling down to Castile to court her daughter Eleanor and her son-in-law Alfonso VIII, selecting Blanche from among the available granddaughters, beginning the long journey back north, with the same methodical care she had always brought to the work of governance. She was too tired, by the time she had made it back as far as Poitiers, to complete the journey north to the French court herself. She handed Blanche into care of the Archbishop of Bordeaux and watched them go, the party moving north toward a future she had helped to arrange but would not live to see settled, a granddaughter she had known for only a few weeks, already becoming part of the ongoing story that her own long life had helped to shape. She stayed at Poitiers for a time, resting. The gray hall of the Maubourgin Tower was there. The light was there. The stone still warm in a particular way that southern stone held warmth, and she was there within it, enormously old, having just crossed the Pyrenees in winter for the second time in her life, returned to a place that had always been most entirely hers. She made her way, in the final years, to Fontevraud. The Abbey of Fontevraud in Anjou was one of the most distinguished religious houses in the Angevin world, a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns, governed by an abbess, which was an unusual and somewhat remarkable arrangement that placed a woman in authority over the whole community, including its male members. It had been the favored burial place of the Plantagenet dynasty, and it held, by the time Eleanor arrived there in any settled way, the tombs of Henry II and of Richard, her husband and her son, the two most consequential men of her middle life, lying now in the quiet stone interior, while the world outside went on rearranging itself without them. She took the veil there, becoming formally a part of the religious community, though she remained Eleanor throughout this transition as she had remained Eleanor through every other transition of her life. The habit was a form rather than a transformation, an accommodation to circumstances rather than an abandonment of self. She received visitors. She continued to correspond, or to be consulted, in ways appropriate to her now contemplative state. She watched the news of John's increasingly turbulent reign arrive from the north, absorbing it with whatever interior response she made to the continuing evidence that her youngest son was, in the ways that mattered most to the long stability she had spent her life trying to build, not equal to the requirements of his inheritance. She watched the world of the troubadours continue its slow change. The culture she had done so much to foster was shifting, moving into new forms in the hands of a new generation who had absorbed the tradition and were now doing with it something different from what she had known. And this is what culture does, always, in the hands of the people who inherit it rather than originate it. The poems were still being written. The oxen was still being sung in the courts of the South. Something of what she had made was still alive, still moving, still producing. The tombs of Henry and Richard lay in the chapel. She would have passed them regularly. In the ordinary daily movement of life in a religious community, moving through the church with the liturgical seasons, the hours marking the days as they had always marked them, the particular quality of Abby's silence. Not the imposed silence of her captivity, but the chosen silence of community that had organized itself around the interior life, surrounding everything with quality of held breath that was not oppressive but, after a very long life of noise and movement and the daily press of events, something almost close to what she had been waiting for. She died on the 1st of April, 1204 at Fontevraud. She was approximately 82 years old, which by the measures of the 12th century placed her so far beyond the ordinary span of a human life that the simple fact of her continued existence had long since become remarkable to the people around her. She had outlived 2 husbands, 4 of her 10 children, and the better part of 2 generations of political contemporaries. She had been a duchess and a queen and a crusader and a prisoner and a diplomat and a patron and a mother, and she had been all of these things with a completeness and an intensity that had left marks on the century, on its politics, on its literature, on the specific configuration of power in the Western world. That would take a long time to fully trace. She was buried at Fontevraud, as Henry and Richard were buried, and a sculpted effigy was placed over her tomb that still exists, that has survived the centuries with its color faded, but its features intact. The face turned slightly upward, the hands holding an open book. Whether the book is a psalter or a romance, or simply the generic volume that tomb effigies of the period often carried as a symbol of learning, it is the right image for her, the image that the long story of her life seems to have been moving toward, a woman who read and thought and argued and felt and governed and endured, who was never, in any of the many conditions to which her life passed, finished with the work of being fully and completely alive. The light at Fontevraud falls through the abbey church with a softness that the thick stone walls produce by filtering and slowing it, stripping from it the directness of the outside world, and leaving something gentler, more diffuse, more patient. It falls on the tombs in the chapel, on the painted stone faces of the people who lie there, Henry, Richard, Eleanor, and Isabel of Angoulême who came later, with the impartiality of light, which does not know or care who any of them were and illuminates them all equally, the way time eventually illuminates everything equally, making of the powerful and the ordinary the same quiet thing. She had held, in her 82 years, more of the world in her hands than most people of any age would ever be near. She had crossed more of it, spoken more of its languages, survived more of its arrangements of loss and change and enforced stillness. She had made things that lasted, a culture, a family, a set of political structures that held for years past her own participation in them, and she had watched things she had made come undone, which is the experience of everyone who lives long enough to see the consequences of their own work. In the end, she put down the book, or the book remained in her hands, which is perhaps truer to the person she had been across the full span of everything. Someone who was always, even at rest, still in some sense reading, still attending, still present to whatever the next page might offer. The candles in the church burned low and then were replaced by other candles, and the seasons moved through the windows in the ordinary way of seasons, and Fontevraud went on being what it had always been, a place of chosen stillness, of the long sustained discipline of the interior life. And outside its walls the world continued with its endless appetite for motion, rearranging itself around the absence of a woman who had spent 8 decades refusing to be arranged around by anyone, and who had succeeded at this more completely than almost anyone before or since. If this story stayed with you, if Eleanor's long life felt like company in the quiet hours, a like or subscription helps more people find their way here, and it means a great deal. Rest well.